The church was quiet, the heavy scent of flowers mixing with the somber atmosphere that had settled over the family. Grandpa Sam had been the patriarch of the family, loved by all who knew him. His death, though expected after a long illness, had still hit them hard. It was a strange feeling, this kind of grief. He had lived a long life, full of stories and wisdom, yet it felt like too soon. Megan, his eldest granddaughter, stood by the coffin, her eyes glistening with tears as she tried to recall the man who had taught her so much about life. How could she say goodbye to someone who had shaped so much of who she was? The funeral had gone as expected. Quiet eulogies, brief reflections, a few soft sobs. But as the mourners began to file out of the church and the family prepared to transport Grandpa Sam to his final resting place, something strange began to happen. The lid of the coffin, it was moving. It started subtly, just the faintest tremble, almost imperceptible at first. Megan thought it was just her imagination, maybe a trick of the shadows or the air, disturbed by the open church doors. But then it happened again, this time unmistakable. She turned to her mother, Lynn, who was standing nearby. "Mom, did you see that?" Megan whispered, her voice shaky. Lynn, her face pale, blinked in confusion. "What do you mean, sweetie?" The coffin trembled again. This time the family members standing nearby noticed as well. A few stepped forward, and Megan's heart began to race. She could feel it. Something wasn't right. "It's him, isn't it?" whispered Kevin, Megan's younger cousin who had been holding his father's hand, looking nervously at the coffin. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of disbelief. "Grandpa Sam, he's not really gone." "Don't be silly," Megan's mother, Lynn, snapped, trying to brush it off. But she wasn't so sure anymore. Her brow furrowed as the coffin lid shifted just enough to cause a small creaking sound. "Mom, look, it's really moving," Kevin said, his voice trembling now, his fear palpable. Before anyone could react, the creaking grew louder, and the lid of the coffin shifted just a little more. The family froze, staring at it with a mix of confusion and fear. There was no mistaking it now. The coffin was opening. "What is happening?" Megan whispered, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around at her relatives, whose expressions ranged from stunned disbelief to outright terror. Kevin, his voice cracking, began to step closer. We have to see what's inside." Megan's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready to face whatever this was. It could be nothing, just a strange coincidence. But a small part of her feared that this was more than that. Something had been stirred, something that should have been left untouched. Against her better judgment, she took a tentative step forward. The lid of the coffin shifted again, slightly ajar, revealing a shadowed figure lying inside. But when the lid opened fully, revealing Grandpa Sam's face, the family gasped. His eyes were wide open, unnaturally wide, staring directly at them, unblinking. He was dead. They had all seen it, felt it. His passing had been so final. But now his body seemed to have a strange life in it. His eyes were open, his mouth slightly agape as though trying to speak, but there was no sound. Megan stepped closer, her stomach turning. This wasn't right. Grandpa Sam's face was too pale, almost waxy, but his eyes, those eyes that had always been full of wisdom, now seemed hollow, lifeless, but not empty. It was as though they were still seeing, still watching. "Why are his eyes open?" Lynn asked, her voice barely audible. She was trembling now, as if trying to convince herself this was just some mistake, some trick of the light. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she bent down slightly to get a better look. There was something else, something more disturbing than just the open eyes. Grandpa Sam's hands, which had been folded across his chest, were now moving. Just slightly at first. An almost imperceptible twitch, as though the body was trying to adjust itself. Megan stepped back quickly, her pulse spiking. She could hear her heart racing in her ears, the sound so loud that it nearly drowned out the whispers that had now begun to fill the room. What was happening? "I don't understand." Megan's voice wavered. He should be dead. He's not supposed to be moving." Her mother looked at her in confusion and terror. "This isn't possible." But then it happened. The body inside the coffin jerked violently, and with a terrible, hollow sound, Grandpa Sam sat up, his eyes still open, his hands still twitching unnaturally. Megan stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room seemed to spin, the cold sweat on her palms making the key in her hand feel like a weight she could barely hold. She had no idea what was happening. Grandpa Sam, the man they had buried just days ago, was now sitting up in his coffin, his eyes wide open and his hands twitching. The room was filled with a strange, tense silence. No one knew what to do. Everyone was frozen, unsure if they were witnessing some twisted hallucination or if this was truly happening. "What the hell is going on?" Kevin whispered, his voice high and shaky with fear. He looked around at the others in a daze, as if looking for someone to explain what they were seeing, but there was no explanation, no comfort, just terror. Grandpa Sam, his body now stiff and unnatural, almost like a puppet on strings, began to move again. This time it wasn't a twitch, it was a deliberate jerk. His arms raised slightly, almost as if he was trying to push himself out of the coffin. "Grandpa." "Sam?" Lynn, Megan's mother, whispered in a voice that trembled with both confusion and fear. "Is that really you?" The air in the room grew cold, colder than it should have been, despite the heat outside. An oppressive weight filled the space, like the room was suffocating under an unseen force. And then, as if something invisible had triggered it, Grandpa Sam's mouth opened. His lips moved, slowly, stiffly, as though he were struggling to speak. But instead of words, a guttural sound, like something dragged from deep within a tomb, escaped his throat. The family took another step back. Megan's heart skipped a beat. "He's not supposed to be alive," Kevin cried, stepping away from the coffin in panic. "He can't be. He's dead. We saw him die." But Megan couldn't take her eyes off her grandfather's face. That wasn't his face anymore. It was as though his features had been distorted, twisted into something that no longer resembled the man she had known. The shadows around the room seemed to shift, and the once warm, comforting atmosphere of the funeral had now turned into a nightmare. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like there was something in the very air, something dark, that was feeding on their fear. "What's happening to him?" Lynn gasped, her face pale, as she reached out to her son, Kevin, for support. But Grandpa Sam, now fully sitting upright in the coffin, began to make a low, rasping sound, like a cough that came too late, a desperate attempt to speak. The sound was chilling, unnatural, and it seemed to reverberate in the very walls of the chapel. And then, in an instant, the unthinkable happened. Grandpa Sam's hand shot up, grabbing the edge of the coffin, his fingers curling around the marble like they had a life of their own. The family gasped, and several people screamed. "No! No, no, no!" Megan's mother cried out. She stumbled back, her legs shaking beneath her. "This isn't real." The thing that had once been Grandpa Sam lifted itself further out of the coffin, his head jerking unnaturally to one side, like his body was fighting against itself. His eyes never blinked. They just stared at them, cold, empty, unblinking. Megan tried to step forward, her legs like lead, but she couldn't stop herself. Something compelled her to get closer to him. Her mind screamed for her to stay away, but her body moved on its own. Her eyes met his, those empty, hollow eyes. And in that instant, it was as if the world stopped moving. There was no warmth, no recognition, no comfort in them. It was like he was staring right through her, and the only thing that remained was a sickening void. "What do you want from us?" Megan found herself asking, her voice trembling with disbelief. "What are you?" For a moment it seemed like the thing, her grandfather's body, didn't hear her. Its head twisted to the side again, its neck making a sickening crack that made everyone wince. Then with a guttural groan, the thing raised its hand and pointed toward the door. The family didn't know what to do. None of them could process what was happening. This couldn't be happening. "Leave!" It rasped, its voice like a whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like Grandpa Sam's voice, but it was distorted, rough, as if something else was speaking through him. "Leave, before it's too late." The entire room went still. Megan's heart raced. Leave? What was he talking about? What was happening to them? But before anyone could respond, the lights in the chapel flickered, and the room was plunged into an eerie, unnatural darkness. A chill swept over the mourners as the air seemed to freeze. And then, the coffin, still half opened, shuddered violently. Everyone screamed. The room seemed to be suffocating them. The lights flickered again, casting fleeting shadows across the chapel. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and Megan could see her breath in the air. Cold, heavy breaths, as if they were trapped in a place that didn't belong to the living. The sound of scraping metal filled the room. Megan spun around to see the coffin lid shifting slightly, moving with an unnatural force. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet was alive, shifting, reacting to the thing now sitting up in the coffin. "No, this can't be happening," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. But the words were swallowed by the growing darkness around them. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, crawling along the walls like something alive. The air crackled with an energy Megan couldn't explain, and every nerve in her body screamed to run. "What do we do?" Kevin's voice broke through the chaos. He was standing near the back of the room, his face pale, his body trembling with fear. "We need to get out of here." But Megan couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the figure before her, the body that had once been Grandpa Sam. The eyes, the empty, hollow eyes, stared at her without blinking, piercing through her. This wasn't him. This wasn't the man who had raised her, who had told stories by the fire, who had laughed with her at family gatherings. This was something else, something darker. And then something else happened. A sound, faint at first, began to emanate from the walls. It was low, almost like a hum, but it was growing louder, a buzzing sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. "What is that?" Megan's mother whispered, looking at the walls in confusion. "What is that noise?" But no one answered. The noise was too loud, drowning out everything else in the room. Megan felt it in her bones, the vibration deep within her body. It wasn't just noise. It was a force, something that was spreading, something that was growing stronger. And then to their horror, the shadows in the room seemed to shift once more, swirling around the coffin, coiling around the figure sitting up inside. A darkness began to pulse from the body. The air grew dense with something that felt like energy, but it wasn't the kind of energy they were used to. This was a force that felt like it could tear the room apart. The figure, Grandpa Sam, didn't move. His body was stiff, almost rigid, but his eyes never left them. Then with a terrible crack, his mouth opened wider than it should have, unnaturally wide, as if it was stretching beyond the limits of human possibility. A sound erupted from his throat, a groan but not a human sound. It was something guttural, a growl that shook the very walls of the chapel. The shadows around him pulsed again, and the light flickered one last time, before plunging them all into total darkness. Megan gasped for air. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only suffocating, oppressive blackness. And then, from the blackness, the voice came again. "You shouldn't have come." It was Grandpa Sam's voice, but it was twisted, deep, rasping, unnatural. "You shouldn't have opened it." Megan's blood ran cold. Opened what? What had they opened? The grave, the coffin, the door to something far darker than they had ever known? But the words were just the beginning. As the shadowy figure of Grandpa Sam rose slowly from the coffin, a sudden force pushed against them. It felt like the very air was being sucked into a void, pulling at their lungs, pulling at their souls. "Get out!" Kevin screamed. He grabbed his mother's arm, pulling her toward the door, but the door wouldn't open. The chapel was sealed, the doors now solid, as if the walls themselves had closed them in. Megan felt like she was suffocating, but she couldn't take her eyes off the thing that had once been her grandfather. It wasn't him anymore. The figure's face was now a hollow mask, twisted and blackened, its eyes still locked onto Megan. The air became thicker, colder, and it was becoming harder to breathe. Her chest tightened, her body froze in place, and all she could do was stare at the figure before her. It was as if the air was being drained out of the room, and the ground beneath her feet felt like it was giving way. The growl grew louder, and a shadow of darkness began to spiral out of the figure's body, expanding, taking form, and twisting. Megan could feel it. This was no longer just about her grandfather. This was about something far older, something that had been sealed away for a reason. "You are the key," the voice rasped through the air, echoing in the darkness. "And now the door will open, and you will join us." Megan felt herself being pulled toward the coffin, as if some invisible force was dragging her, her feet stumbling over the floor. She tried to resist, but it was as though the very shadows were calling her, wrapping around her like chains. With one final desperate push, Megan reached out, trying to break free from the force that had a hold of her. She reached for the door, for the light, but it was as if she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. And then from behind her, she heard a voice. A whisper, but it was familiar. "Megan!" She turned, eyes wide in panic. But it wasn't Grandpa Sam who had spoken. It was her own voice, whispering back at her. Megan's heart raced as the room seemed to close in on her. The shadows stretched and danced around her, creeping along the walls like sentient entities, hungry and alive. Her body felt heavy, like the darkness itself was pressing against her chest, suffocating her, as if it was trying to pull her into its depths. The whisper, her voice, still echoed in her mind. "Megan." She spun around, desperate to understand, but the figure, Grandpa Sam's body, was moving toward her again, its eyes glowing with unnatural light, its hands outstretched as though it were reaching for her. The growl in its throat grew louder, its mouth stretching wider, as if something was trying to force its way out from inside. "No!" Megan screamed, stumbling backward. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like she was moving through thick molasses, her feet dragging as if she were stuck in place. The shadows, the cold, the oppressive weight of the room. It all felt like it was part of her now, pulling her back in. The whispers grew louder, hundreds of voices layered over each other, distorting the words, making it impossible to focus. It felt like the chapel was alive, a twisted, suffocating entity feeding on their fear. "It's coming for you." The figure's voice wasn't Grandpa Sam's anymore. It was deeper, guttural, full of malice. It spoke in a language Megan didn't understand, but the intensity of its words was unmistakable. It was summoning something, something far darker. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She had to get out. She had to break free. But the chapel was no longer just a building. It had become a prison, its walls alive with malevolent energy. She could feel it. The walls were pressing in on her, the air growing colder and colder with each passing second. The shadows around the coffin shifted, moving in unnatural ways, as though they had a life of their own. They twisted, they writhed, reaching out for Megan, clawing at the air, trying to drag her back into the abyss. And then a chill ran down her spine. She felt the presence before she saw it. A cold, dark energy that hovered at the edges of her vision, like a weightless fog, a dark cloud that was growing larger and closer. In the distance beyond the coffin, something emerged from the shadows. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly black, standing with a form that wasn't fully human. Its shape was distorted, constantly shifting, like it wasn't meant to be in this world. It was monstrous, a shadow of what could have been human, but now twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. The figure stared at her, its glowing eyes piercing through her, and Megan felt a jolt of fear shoot through her body, as if her very soul were being torn apart. The air thickened again, and she felt herself being pulled toward the figure, like a magnet drawing her in. Her legs finally gave way, and she dropped to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure's presence was so overwhelming, so unnaturally powerful, that it was as if it held the very fabric of reality in its grasp. "Leave! Leave now!" she gasped, her voice weak as she tried to crawl away. But no matter how much she tried to move, she couldn't escape it. The presence was all around her, closing in with each passing moment, and she realized, with a terrifying clarity, that there was no way out. The figure took one slow step forward, its shadowy form blotting out the dim light that remained in the chapel. and in a voice that was both ancient and familiar, it spoke, "You have opened the door. There is no return." Megan's breath hitched, and she felt the tears well up in her eyes. She couldn't fight this. There was nothing left to do. This wasn't about her. This was about something much darker, something that had been locked away for too long, and now it was free. The air grew cold again, colder than before. Megan's skin prickled as the ground beneath her seemed to vibrate with dark energy. The figure was getting closer, and Megan realized with horror that it wasn't just the shadow. It was the thing behind the shadow that had been waiting. The entity that had been buried with Grandpa Sam was now awakening fully, and Megan was at the center of it. "It is too late, Megan. You have chosen your fate." The voice was no longer speaking to her. It was speaking through her, like she was part of something much larger, something she could not control. As the figure reached out its hand, Megan closed her eyes, resigning herself to the terror she couldn't escape. But just as it was about to touch her, a sharp light filled the room, blinding her, flashing brighter than anything she had ever seen. The air around her began to shatter, the walls trembling as if they were breaking apart, and then silence. The blinding light filled the room, and Megan squeezed her eyes shut, heart racing, body trembling. The oppressive coldness was replaced with a sudden warmth, as though a veil had been lifted. For a moment everything stopped, the chaos, the fear, the dark figure that had been closing in on her. All of it was suspended in a brief, unbearable silence. And then, it vanished. The light receded, leaving Megan blinking, disoriented, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. She opened her eyes slowly, and the room seemed to have shifted. The shadows were gone, replaced by a soft, golden glow that didn't belong in the once dark, cursed chapel. The figure, the thing, was gone. It had faded into the air, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread in its wake. Megan pushed herself to her feet, her knees weak, her breath shallow. What just happened? She looked around, her eyes searching the room. Everything was eerily quiet, as if the chapel had returned to its original state, untouched by the horrors that had just occurred. But the heavy feeling in her chest remained. The silence felt wrong. The golden light seemed too bright, too out of place. Megan wasn't sure if this was a trick of the mind or if something had truly changed. But the questions swirling in her mind were overwhelming. She turned to look at her family, who were still frozen in place. Kevin, still pale, stood near the back, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Lynn, her mother, was looking at her, her expression a mixture of confusion and terror. They had seen it too. "Is it over?" Lynn whispered, her voice breaking through the silence like a soft cry. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the room as though she were waiting for the darkness to return. Megan opened her mouth, but the words felt like they were stuck in her throat. Was it over? Had they truly escaped the darkness? Or had they merely bought themselves time? "I don't know," Megan whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know if it's over." The air around them was heavy again, but this time it felt different, still, like something was waiting. Watching. Megan turned back toward the coffin, her pulse quickening as she dared to glance at it. She half expected to see the coffin still open, the shadowy figure rising from it again. But the coffin, though disturbed, was empty now. There was no movement, no signs of anything alive or dead inside. But the unease settled in her stomach like a cold stone. Megan reached down to where the key was still clutched tightly in her hand. The metal felt warm now, almost as if it were alive with some lingering energy. What had this key unlocked? What had they all opened? And was it truly sealed? Before Megan could think about it any longer, a strange sound echoed through the chapel. The floor creaked. A loud, sudden crack broke the silence. It was the sound of something beneath the floor, something that had been disturbed by the chaos that had unfolded above. "No," Megan whispered, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. "Not again." The wooden floorboards trembled as if something was shifting below them. The air became electric, and Megan's breath quickened. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, that sickening sense of inevitability. It wasn't over. The curse wasn't broken. It had only been delayed. The cracking noise grew louder, and before anyone could move, a section of the chapel floor burst open with a violent force. A dark, swirling tornado of shadow began to rise from the newly revealed hole in the ground, its edges writhing, reaching toward the family as if it were alive, eager to consume everything in its path. "Run!" Megan screamed, but it was too late. The shadows swirled around them, and in an instant, the chapel was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, a cage, and they were all trapped within it. Megan reached for her mother's hand, pulling her away from the dark vortex that was spiraling at the center of the room. Kevin, still too stunned to fully comprehend the danger, stumbled beside them. But the shadows were everywhere now, closing in on them, blocking every path. The air grew thick again, and the whispering began. Hundreds of voices, echoing through the darkness, speaking in tongues, warning them, taunting them. Megan couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the malevolent intent in every syllable. "We need to leave now," Lynn cried, but there was no way out. The doors to the chapel were sealed once again, locked in place by the force that had descended upon them. The dark vortex at the center of the room spun faster, and Megan could feel herself being pulled in. The shadows reached out for her, grasping at her arms, her legs. It felt like something was trying to drag her into the abyss. "We have to stop it," Megan cried. "The key! We have to use the key!" But the shadows were too strong now, too overwhelming. The key that had once felt like their hope now seemed useless in the face of the chaos. In that moment, as the shadows closed in, Megan realized something chilling. There was no escape. They had unlocked something far darker than they could have imagined. And the cycle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The shadows swirled around them, dark tendrils reaching for their feet, crawling up their legs like living darkness. Every breath Megan took felt heavier, as if the very air was thickening with malice. The voices, hundreds of voices, filled the room with an unearthly chorus. Some of them were whispers, others were low, guttural growls. They all echoed together, bouncing off the walls, twisting into a maddening cacophony that was impossible to escape. Megan's heart raced as the shadows began to close in tighter. Her feet felt like they were stuck in place, the weight of the darkness holding her down. It was like the very chapel itself was alive, suffocating them, trapping them in a nightmare they couldn't escape. She looked around, desperately searching for a way out, but there was nothing. The doors were still sealed. The windows had long since been obscured by thick shadows. Her eyes landed on the key still clutched in her hand. Its once warm metal was now cold and slick with sweat. "We need to use it," Megan screamed, her voice hoarse and raw. She reached for the key, knowing deep down that it was the only thing that could save them. But in the back of her mind, a chilling thought echoed. Had they gone too far? Was it already too late? The dark vortex at the center of the room was now pulling at everything around them. It was like the earth itself was opening, a rift into something ancient and incomprehensible. It felt as if the very ground was giving way to an abyss, and they were being drawn into it, helpless, vulnerable, with nowhere to run. Kevin stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. "Megan, what are we supposed to do?" he cried out. His voice was shrill, and his hands shook violently. "It's too much." Megan swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. She turned to her mother, who was standing behind her, just as frightened. "We need to use the key, Mom. Please." But Lynn, looking into the swirling shadows, seemed paralyzed. She was terrified. Everyone was terrified. The very air felt like it was closing in, pushing them toward the dark, writhing mass that continued to grow in front of them. Without thinking, Megan reached out and pushed the key toward the dark vortex, praying, hoping that somehow this ancient object would hold the power to stop it. The key trembled in her hand, almost as though it were alive, as if it too felt the weight of what was about to happen. With a final breath, Megan plunged the key into the center of the vortex, and immediately everything exploded. The chapel walls shook with a deafening roar. The ground beneath them cracked, and the dark shadows that had once filled the room burst into light, burning away as the key reacted with a blinding energy. Megan's vision was filled with blinding, searing white light, and for a moment she thought she was going to be consumed by it. But then, the light faded. The room went silent. Megan could hear her own breathing, shallow and desperate, her heart still pounding in her chest. She opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light that had returned to the chapel. Everything was still. The shadows were gone. The oppressive air had lifted. The chapel, though dark, felt empty, like the weight of something heavy had finally been lifted from its walls. Megan looked around at her family. They were all still standing, barely, but they were there. They were safe. The coffin that had once held Grandpa Sam lay open, but now it was just an ordinary, empty casket. No darkness, no twisted figure inside. The key that had been in her hand was now just a piece of metal, dull and ordinary, no longer pulsing with strange energy. But even as the relief began to wash over her, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was not truly over. The curse, the darkness, it had been pushed back, but something told her that it would always come back. Nothing that dark stays gone forever. And as she looked around at the empty chapel, she realized one thing. They were free for now. But the key had opened something far bigger than any of them could understand. There was always something waiting, always something more powerful, more ancient, lurking beneath the surface. The door had been opened, but the darkness had only been delayed. She took a deep breath, and as the last of the fog lifted from her mind, she understood. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.